Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the Banned Book Club. Thank you for listening to us last week. And here we are today, me and Lily. How are you today, Lily?
I'm feeling good. I'm excited that we made it to episode 2. We're really
Crazy.
doing the damn thing.
We really are. There's no going back now, I guess.
It's exciting. It's cool. I love that we have taken like actionable steps and that it left the group chat.
I know, it left the group chat and surprisingly is reaching folks kind of everywhere. Shout out to folks listening to us in Ukraine and in Chile. Hola, hello. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Everyone in the US also, much love. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Another beautiful little episode here for y'all today.
Yeah, today we're going to talk about the history of book burning and book bans because it's not a new phenomenon.
Oh yeah, we're definitely going to be digging a little bit into the archives. We're going to talk some history and, I hope you enjoy it. Should we dive into it?
No better time, I guess.
All right, Lily, as a resident historian, I feel like you gotta start us off. First and foremost, I guess the question that we should probably answer folks is what is a ban? What is a book ban? Why do we care?
Yeah, so, knowledge is power. So, a lot of book bans and book burnings throughout history have come from conquering entities trying to destroy a culture or destroy an identity in order to better control the people they're attacking and invading. Book bans, definitely not a new thing in human history. Words and the spread of ideas is powerful. That's why those in power are those who worry that their way of life is being threatened by new ideas, and they turn to destroying those books or scrolls or oral histories, whatever it is. Back in 213 BC, the Chinese emperor ordered a bonfire of books as a way of consolidating power in his new empire. And according to historian Lois May Chan, quote, his basic objective was not so much to wipe out these schools of thought completely as to place them under governmental control, end quote. So it's all about the control of knowledge and power. And then you move over to the Mediterranean world, where you had the legendary Library of Alexandria, where it's estimated there were 40 to 400,000 scrolls in this library over the course of a couple hundred years. And
Damn,
it was, yeah.
that's so
Um,
much.
and it was one of those like ancient marvels of, or seven wonders of the ancient world.
Yeah.
And it was burned several times in its history, most famously in 48 BC by Julius Caesar when he attacked Egypt. Book bans go back to ancient times. And according to historian Rebecca Kunth, who is the author of Libricide, the regime sponsored destruction of books and libraries in the 20th century. The Enlightenment era saw a decrease in book bans and burnings because there was this idea that every man, because let's be honest, it was mostly men, should have
Yep.
a bit of an education and to be able to, aspire to these great philosophical goals that, came to the US in the Declaration of Independence and the all men are created equal side of things is very, very Enlightenment ideals. So, moving on, through that Enlightenment period, people saw knowledge as a way to change themselves, the world, and it became a much more dangerous commodity, no longer controlled exclusively by the elite. So, when you move into the 20th and in sometimes the 19th century, those in power were really trying to limit the education of the poor, the working class, because they didn't want people to rise up and go against them. Of course, the most famous of book bans and book burnings in the 20th century was in Nazi Germany during World War II, which we will talk a lot more about when we get to our first book episode when we talk about the book thief. So, yeah,
Crazy.
just end our little history aside here with a quote that I really loved from author Barbara Tuchman that she made at the Library of Congress in 1980. Quote, Books are the carriers of civilization. Without books, history is silent, literature is dumb, science crippled, thought and speculation at a standstill. Without books, the development of civilization would have never been possible. End quote.
Damn, I mean that's a strong one to finish off. I mean, when we're thinking like obviously we acknowledge a level of bias in making a podcast that is, all about books. We are going to be emphasizing that. We might make references to other sorts of media, but the core of this book club is at the end of the day books. And also thinking about the breadth of knowledge that comes from books. Like obviously we are at a point in history where like technological advancement has surpassed, and we have, if anyone has a question, they just go to Google more often than like going to a library. But when you're thinking of pre-internet, the internet is not that old, you know? If I'm not
Oh,
mis It's well, like what, 20 years? They started in
the
when
90s.
yeah, like what, modem and dial-up?
Yeah. But like growing up writing a research paper in school, I had to go find an encyclopedia or definitely go visit the library and take out books on whatever subject it was.
Oh
But it
yeah,
was not an easy Google search away by any means.
absolutely not, which is it's definitely a different space to exist in. And it's also just like when you're thinking of books, like there's just like such a there are so many things that you wouldn't think about that maybe you like there are some people that like, oh, I'm gonna Google just everything. I'm gonna like oh, I'm curious about this, I'm curious about that. Like, what's the ending of my show? Like, what is this word? What does this mean? Blah blah blah. But when you're thinking of like books and when you're going to like literally sitting in a library or like going in, like a lot of it is just, unless you're looking for something specific, you're just wandering the shelves, like looking for something that's going to catch your eye and thinking of like, there are so many things that you could have never found if you hadn't just been wandering through these little shelves. And especially when we're at a point in time where unfortunately book bans have become even more prevalent and will continue to become even more prevalent with our current administration in place. There is just so much knowledge that is going to get, I don't want to say lost, because I don't think we're at a point where things are going to be lost, but definitely to a point where there are many things that are being going to be completely blocked and completely like taken away and inaccessible for a lot of folks, particularly as a lot of these, when we're looking at these book bans and we're looking at things that are happening, there's very specific topics that are being tackled first and foremost.
Which, on that note, do we want to talk about the 2024 banned book list and what were the most, contested books out there?
I mean, yeah, I think we might as well talk about it. I mean, we can pull up Pen America is where we are getting this list from. For anyone who doesn't know what Pen America is, it's an organization, but I'm actually going to go ahead and read y'all their mission statement because we do fact checking on this podcast, y'all. Like we're legit.
We are certified academics. We, I'm not an armchair historian. This is what I do for a living.
Yeah,
You
this
gotta have the receipts.
all like we're hopping on a podcast right now and talking about all these things, but like anyone who knows us in real life, we're the exact same way. Like, all right, so for anyone who doesn't know what Pen America is, Pen America was founded in 1922 and it's the largest of more than 100 centers worldwide that make up Penn International Network. Penn America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. They champion the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Their mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expressions and defend the liberties that make it possible. With that, they work to ensure that people everywhere have the freedom to not only create literature, but to convey information, ideas, and express their views and to access views, ideas, and literatures of others. Very big fans of the First Amendment, to say the least. But Pen America is one of the organizations that basically compiles the massive list of book bans, specifically more so than anywhere else, of school book bans. Looking at the 2023 to 2024 school year for the one that we're going to be accessing and talking about right now. They essentially go through and compile not just in any specific state, but across the US and create a full index of school book bans so that if you are someone that is interested in things like that, it's somewhere that it's accessible. It also tells you why things are being challenged and why people are going after it. And of course, as we go through the list and we talk more about it, you'll notice that there's a lot of authors that are repeat. I don't want to say offenders because I feel like offenders is not the right word, but they're repeat picks for being challenged and being banned. I guess we can start with the top 11. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it.
So coming in at number one, we have 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult. Picoult. I'm apologizing in advance in this podcast. Obviously, now that we have a podcast about this, I have to really, make sure that I'm pronouncing people's names right. But I am apologizing in advance if any names are butchered or mispronounced. When you go from just solely reader to then speaking about it, there is a level of error in that way that will come across. But essentially, this book is the story about a devastating aftermath of a small town's tragedy. We won't talk specifics about what any of the books are about right now. We're just going to go through the list. At number two, we have Looking for Alaska by John Green. And this book has 97 bands to 19 minutes, 98 bands. So they're one after the other. John Green is also one of the authors that you'll see on here frequently. Number three is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky with 85 bands. Number four is Sold by Patricia McCormick with 85 bands. Number five is a tie with 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. You may know the series of the same name, comes from that same novel. Crank parentheses Crank series by Ellen Hopkins with 76 bands. And number seven is Identical by Ellen Hopkins. We're noticing the same author with two books in the top 11 with 74 bands. Number eight, Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini with 73 bands. Number nine, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood with 67 bands. There's also a series that corresponds with the novel. And for number 10, we have a tie with Water for Elephants by Sarah Gruen with 66 bands. This novel is also the basis of both a movie and a Broadway show. And then lastly, Tricks by Ellen Hopkins at 66 bands. Notice Ellen Hopkins mentioned for the third time in just the top 11. Keep in mind that the full index makes up more than 4,000 unique titles. And it's over 10,000 instances of individual books banned. Like just thinking about that number is insane.
Yeah, so many.
It's something that we can link it in the show notes for folks to check it out, and in the description of our show. But one of the things that I really like about PEN America is that not only is it obviously like a massive resource having all these books compiled and put into one space, but when you're going through the big index, it's also telling you which books, like the status of the ban. So some of them say like specifically like are banned. Some of them say banned pending investigation. Others are it's a formal challenge versus informal challenge, things like that. So it's interesting to see which places, and it's also organized alphabetically by state. We're starting off with like when you're looking at the big massive index, it starts off with Alaska and then goes on and so forth. But obviously, a lot of these states, particularly states that are more on the red side of things, will have an increased number of book bans as opposed to blue states. Like even just thinking about it, like the amount of like I can't recall at least growing up being in middle school, being in high school, there being this level, like obviously there was still some amount of like books that were being like parents going to administration being like, I don't think this is appropriate, things like that. Like I remember in my ninth grade English class, like our reading list was changed from over the summer to the school year based on, curriculum changes and things like that. But to have this level of book challenges,
I don't ever recall there being a like question of banned books in my schools. I remember an English teacher in high school encouraging us to read banned books, but I can't recall if there was ever a specific instance at my schools in particular. I'm sure there had to have been something.
Yeah.
I just wasn't aware of it at the time.
I think for context, I did middle school, high school in Florida. And you, Lily?
I K through 12 in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously we're coming to this with differing state
Mhm.
things. I will say I did go to private school. Unfortunately in Florida, the at least, depending on where you are in Florida, education's different, but the public education system in Florida is not the best. So I was fortunate enough to have a scholarship to go to private school, but even then, like there were still some very vague, not enough to like the level that today this is normalized. And as someone like I teach, so this is even when we're talking about like lesson plans and things, like there are certain books that we've already been told as teachers that it's like, oh, those types of books like we can't talk about, or like certain topics just like are not appropriate to bring in, and like certain schools have specific things. Even as modern day events are taking place, some topics on certain things are not allowed for us to bring in. And I'm currently working in the public school system here in New York. So that's been an interesting thing to now start to experience on the educator side of things.
Mm.
But this is so crazy. I mean, like what are some of the things that you think about looking at this list?
There are definitely some of those books that I read in high school. Like Perks of Being a Wallflower, we read that in high school. I think it was assigned reading or maybe summer reading. But there are definitely times I look back at when I read certain things as a kid and I was maybe too young for it, but for the most part, my parents were pretty, you know, encouraging of reading and learning everything. And if I had questions or something didn't make sense, I could go and ask them and they'd explain to the rest of their ability to meet me at that right age level.
Yeah.
One instance in particular, because my dad and I have joked about it, I was definitely reading Diary of Anne Frank way too young. There were just certain things in that book that I guess I asked him about it, and he just didn't have answers for me yet because I think I was in the fourth grade reading Diary of Anne Frank. Like it's a heavy subject for a kid of that age, but I wanted to read it, so my parents said sure. And then going back and reading it a little bit older, I think we read it in the eighth grade. It made more sense, and I had a broader context of the history and the world and everything else happening. So I think that's the danger of book bans is totally discounting them. I understand putting in, age restrictions or suggesting that, you know, maybe this is above their grade level. I think a lot of books in schools already have that general grade level. So, sticking to that. But at some point, like with the internet, these resources do become available to everybody.
Yeah.
So why not make it in a safe learning space to have those discussions and to better understand the context around everything?
No, yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I think it's also think a lot about like the books that are popularized also on like social media through things like Book Talk, Bookstagram, BookTube, like all these different book communities on these platforms. There's a lot of books on this list that are very big titles within these communities and very
Hmm.
big spaces that everyone's like, oh my God, you have to go read it. Like it's this. And I'm not just talking about like smutty books, like let's talk about it. There is a side of Book Talk that is in the book social media communities that is focused on smutty book, and that's for folks, but there's also a wide breadth of like literature and deep philosophical type things and like different types of tropes that come with in the same way that a movie can be a film and like a classic and be a cult classic, you can have the same reverence for books. So it's definitely interesting to look at a lot of these books. And I think it's also particularly interesting when an author in particular is being heavily challenged. Like John Green is someone who's heavily challenged in general. Obviously with the top 11 list, Ellen Hopkins is someone who's being heavily challenged in general. Other folks that are being heavily challenged, George Orwell,
which is so
Jody.
crazy to me.
There's just like
I
there's
read what 1984 and Animal Farm in school. Like that
yeah,
was just part of the curriculum.
yeah.
And now it's up for banning.
And I
Wild.
mean, you think a lot about like obviously these are books like we're talking about these the required reading a lot of these were within like English classes. But even thinking about like the information that goes into your history books that you're learning in school, that varies from state to state. And there
100%.
are like the education, there's the Department of Education that's like federally the United States Department of Education.
Hmm.
And then each state has their own subsect of that. And with that, each individual state subsect, depending on who's in office and depending on who's in legislator, they can choose what goes into your history books. So thinking about like there are stuff that I learned about that I had talked to folks when I got to college and I was like, "Oh, you didn't learn about that? That's so random." Or like just like the breadth of things and in general, I'm gonna say it. The history books that you are being taught in school are whitewashed. There's a lot of
Oh, 1000%. Without a doubt.
like
History is written by the victors.
correct. We're talking about history, and even us, like sitting here, we're talking about history, we're talking about these things, but we have to seek out, like actively seek out external voices and like voices of folks that have and will be going through things and are people of color or indigenous, are female, are queer, are blank, insert, describer here. But it's just so crazy just how even something like, oh, American Civic class varies from state to state.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest eye opener for me as a historian, like going from high school to college. I've always loved history, so there was no doubt about what I would be majoring in, but the breadth of what I was missing
Yeah.
going into college was insane.
Yeah.
Insane.
And I mean like you focus on history. I can even like attest to that as an art history minor. The things that we talked about in art history and like the voices covered, the artists that we covered, there are a lot of artists that I was like, I did not know that we had record of these folks existing. Or like the first time that I took a Latin American focused art history class, it was like life-changing because I was like, I don't know how I'm gonna like learn about art history outside of the viewpoint of like a Eurocentric
Hmm.
white male patriarchal space. Which is fine. Some people are really in for that within art history, but for someone who I was like, oh, I'm seeking out something different, to that class for me was a breath of fresh air to be like, oh
Hmm.
my God, there's people that we just have ignored in history. Crazy.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, do you recall like an instance for you being a history major and being a historian of, I don't know, either learning about a piece of history or something that you were exposed to that you were like, I'm shocked that I did not know about this earlier or had access to this before?
Yeah, the big one for me was learning about American involvement in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like a lot of what I learned pre-college of American history was
Mm-hmm.
very, North America centric,
Mm-hmm.
and then the World Wars. A little bit, talking about Korea or Vietnam and the conflicts over there, but at no point in time did we ever, ever, ever discuss Latin and South American history. And so I was in an American Studies class talking about the US in different countries and in
Yeah.
different contexts. And we learned about the CIA just disrupting governments in South America. Um,
We could do a
and
full
in
podcast about
particular,
this.
El Salvador. And I was just like, why is this the first time I've heard of any of this? Because you're right, it could be a whole different episode to talk about the way that we just totally, we, America, messed up those countries. And now we're surprised that immigrants are trying to leave because we messed them up. But that's a whole totally other side tangent. But that
And I
one
have the
was
book to
in
go with it.
particular,
I have a book
that
to go
one
with it. I'll send it your way.
was very, very eye-opening to be like, oh, so we didn't just, go over to Europe. We went further south too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I it's so interesting that you bring that up because obviously like I'm being from Latin America, I did do a lot of my schooling in the US, but you like just the rhetoric in this country versus my home country of Colombia and even history, like I learned a lot of history from home, just externally through family, through my own research, because obviously living and being an immigrant, you're like, I still want to know about my country. I still want to know about my space. And it would be so interesting to me, like sitting in class, like listening to all these things, and I'm like, that's not what happened. Like that's not true. But and I would bring things up in class when I was, you know, feeling more bold, but I was always like, this is like not the full story. This is not actually like there's a lot of key information being like taken like out of context here, like removed and I think that's something that often happens, particularly with like historical and non-fiction biographical
Hmm.
type of content. Because a lot of that content is only coming from one narrator. And in general, when you have one narrator, there's a level of bias that is just going to come across regardless of who the narrator is, because it is from a one point
Hmm.
perspective. It's not looking, and history books in general should be coming from multiple perspectives. Cough, cough. But in general, for the most part, like the you have folks that are, as we said at the beginning of this episode, like armchair historians. And then you have folks that are like actually sitting there being academics and looking for different sources, looking for different information to back up the research that they're doing. And as the American public, as children growing up, you don't really choose what it is that you're exposed to until you essentially go to college, or if you in high school are like choosing what you're doing research on and things like that. I would say college is probably the first space where you can kind of choose what it is that you're focused on.
Yeah. And to like bring it back around to what you said, you're not getting the full story often. And so back to books, that's a great place where you can try and get that broader context and
Yeah.
find those other voices. And so when you're browsing a library, you can see here's all of the books they have on one topic and just go crazy. See what everybody is saying
Yeah.
and what the conversation is from those books. And I guess just the moral of the story is you cannot stick to just one source. Go out there and read everything and double check where you're getting your information.
Literally, always question where you're getting your information from, also where you're getting your news. Look at different broadcast channels and news organizations that you're getting your news from, and watch more than one so that you're getting cohesive information that is true and not misinformation.
Look at your local news sources.
Yeah,
We're big on look at your local resources. Go to your local library, read your local newspaper, you know, support the small business.
correct. And I think, I guess to wrap it up and wrap up this little episode, I think one other source of censorship that we would be remiss to not mention is the ongoing conversation about the TikTok ban. Like obviously in our first episode we briefly mentioned it as a funny little
Will they, won't they?
well they won't they? We're now tuning in. We're recording this on January 30th. They did in fact ban the app. The ban only lasted for 12 hours, which is a bit of a joke if you ask me. But it was in fact banned, and when everyone came back on to the app, as a user, Lily's not a user, but Lily follows the conversation around all this. But as a user, I know I myself and also many of the folks that are TikTok app havers, users, creators, there was a lot that was changed about the algorithm. And there were a lot of things that were popping up that were very, there was a lot of far right stuff, for example. There was also a lot of things that were not the best. And it's also like, obviously, any of these algorithms that you're going on to, they're going to curate the kind of things that you enjoy seeing. So if you're someone with more liberal views, obviously the things that you're going to be getting are going to be more on the left versus getting a whole right side of propaganda, pun intended. But it also goes to show like there was a lot. I think what was one of the biggest things for me when originally the app was taken offline, there was a message saying that due to US like guidelines and regulations, and I'll find a screenshot of it, and for the those that will be watching us on video, I'll put it up on the screen so you guys can follow along. But it was essentially saying due to guidelines and the ongoing ban in courts, the app is currently unavailable, but we are working to try to get this back up. And then it was very quickly that original message was changed to we are working with President Donald Trump and for a media company, because at the end of the day, like TikTok is a media company of sorts. For a media company to blatantly reference the President Donald Trump by name, that is a big deal. That's not something that these media companies and these places typically do. Like it's not like normal. And if you went to inauguration or if you saw videos of the inauguration, front row at inauguration, there were all of the big tech conglomerates
Mhm.
sitting front row attending. And then obviously you're seeing then Meta announce that they're taking away fact checking. Twitter, also known as X, has been a rampant site for misinformation ever since, Elon Musk took over and much of the Twitter workforce was cut down through layoffs and just restructuring of jobs and things. And when the TikTok app came back online, there was a thank you to Mr. President Donald Trump that was pushed out to all users. And this is, again, not norm. Even if this is an ongoing case going on with different things, you don't see media companies specifically naming a political figure by name to thank for making something happen. And this is to say, like, the TikTok is still like more than likely going to get banned again unless something changes. They were giving an extension of 75 days, you know?
Big thing there was the TikTok ban came from Congress and went to the courts. So there's not much the executive branch, Trump, the president, can actually do except extend the conversation
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, it came from the legislation. So it creates a really interesting conversation around where a line's being drawn or crossed
Hmm.
when it comes to the separation of all three branches of government,
Yeah.
which is an ongoing conversation, I think, to just
Yeah.
see how this all plays out.
Yeah,
and things like
censorship
that.
is a very real thing. Like a lot of what we talked about in this episode is specifically talking about books, but censorship is also in your phone. It's on your TV screen, computer screen. It's even in the billboards that you're seeing and the ads that you're getting. So definitely, I think a good thing to end on is just question everything.
And we're not conspiracy theorists.
No.
We're not, but like
We may sound like it, but we're not.
question everything, but then educate yourself.
Hmm.
That's the big caveat there is then educate yourself.
Yeah. Seek out multiple forms of information. Don't just stick to one. In the same way that, like, obviously, one of the things with books is books are printed on specific time periods, years. A lot can change in a year, in a month, in 75 days. But yeah, seek out multiple forms of getting information, particularly if you're keeping up with current events and with things happening around you. Look to local forms of information, local news branches, go to your library, read books.
And we promise the next episode we'll actually talk about fully the book we read.
Yeah, tune in for next episode where we will be chit-chatting about The Book Thief. Oh my God. I've
But your little background is
I know I have a
watching the
background.
book a little bit.
I have
But
to do
yes,
the makeup like hand behind the book for it to actually focus. But for next episode, we'll be talking about The Book Thief. If you haven't read it before, feel free to read it and give us a listen as we chit chat about it in the next episode. But yeah, I guess we'll see y'all next time. Thanks for tuning in and coming to the Band Book Club.
yeah. Thanks everyone.
Have a good day.